All right, good evening, everybody. I'm very excited to bring you some amazing authors this evening for an amazing discussion about more amazing authors and more amazing books, specifically in the Southern genre category. And we're going to talk about, why that's even a thing. Why is Southern fiction even a thing? My name is Sherry Stout. I'm with Main Street Reads, and this idea was conceived of by a brilliant author whom I adore. His name is Joe Palmer. Joe wrote a book called The Mariner's Tale that released in the fall of 2020 and has enjoyed great success already, despite the recent unpleasantness. And he's been doing a phenomenal job and just gets rave reviews wherever he goes with the work. And also joining us principally will be Jonathan Haupt, who's the executive director of the Pat Conroy Literary Center, and probably one of the best known and most adored editors and champions of great Southern work across the country. Talk to anybody, any editor countrywide, and they will tell you the man is pure genius. So with that, I'm going to let Joe go ahead and start off. Joe, introduce yourself a little bit, and then I will traipse us on through the slides. We'll ask folks to stay muted until the end of the presentation, which will only be about 20 minutes or so. And then we're going to open it up to just some live back and forth, because we want to hear what y'all love about Southern literature and which are your favorite authors as well. Okay. So Joe, take it away.
Hey y'all, thanks for stopping by to talk Southern to me. And my name is Joe Palmer. I'm the author of A Mariner's Tale, which, as Sherry said, was released on October 25th, 2020. I grew up in a little town in South Georgia called Waycross. Not very many people there. I was always the kid who doodled his way through school. I wasn't very good at a lot of the subjects, but I could write. And so I had a teacher for creative writing in my senior year who told me, you need to pursue this, you're good at it. And so that was sort of my dream, was to become an author. Of course, life gets in the way of a lot of things. And the Vietnam War was just sort of in its waning days. And rather than sit around and wait to get drafted, I joined the Navy and became a medic. And when I got out, I went back to college and pursued my degree in English and literature. My dream was to become a college literature professor, and I could see myself holding forth to enraptured students in a classroom. But of course, that wasn't going to work. And so I became a newspaper reporter. I worked for 3 different newspapers, the Braden and Herald, the Macon Telegraph and News, and my last assignment was the Florida Times Union here in Fernandina Beach. And I took my investigative reporting experience and went on to become an investigator, first with the State Public Defender's Office, and then I was recruited by the feds in 1995, and I retired as an investigator with the Federal Public Defender's Office in 2012. And at that point I said, I'm going to resume pursuing my writing. I did a column for the local newspaper, the Fernandina Beach News Leader, for 10 years. It was called Cup of Joe. And it was basically just sort of folksy stuff, some fact, some fiction, all sort of blended together. And I credit that for helping me really sharpening my writing chops, which had gotten a little rusty just writing official government reports for a few years. But my wife and I were restoring an old sailboat, and one afternoon while working on the boat, this idea of my novel just came to me, and I came home that evening and started writing. Had no idea where I was going with it at first, but there we are.
All right, very cool. Jonathan, weigh in.
Thank you, Sherry. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. By way of Sherry's welcome, I've already found out that I'm beloved and a genius, so I'm really glad I showed up. This has been an education already. And I'm always glad to hang out with Joe, who's become a great friend to us here in Beaufort. Joe has been to our Pat Conroy Literary Festival and our Pat Conroy Literary Center any number of times. I am a native of Bloody Breathitt County, Kentucky, which is so named because it is a place of great violence and stories and not always much education. So I grew up with family who came from that, who had stories that maybe they wanted to tell and maybe they didn't want to tell. It always seemed kind of mysterious in my childhood. But I found my way as a young person in growing up on Lake Michigan, Northern Illinois, to a bookstore, a place called Galaxy of Books, and a bookseller, Eileen, whose name I remember to this day, who introduced me to the world of literature. And I had the benefit, very much like Pat Conroy, of a mother who read to me, a mother who loved books as well. And those two forces got me invested in the world of literature. And along the way, I had the benefit of many good teachers, one of whom was Pat Conroy, who was my friend and my partner, my student in some ways, all during the last 5 years of his life too. When I was the director of the University of South Carolina Press, and got very excited about the idea of our state's flagship university publishing novels and short story collections and children's books and poetry and all these things I thought we could be doing for the citizens of South Carolina and the South and beyond. And Pat Conroy, to the surprise of friends and family, and certainly to me, volunteered to be editor at large of a project that became Story River Books that we'll mention a little bit later in the evening as well. It's a transformative experience for me to work with Pat, to know Pat, to see him in action at that point in his life when he didn't owe a thing to anybody and wanted very much to be, to live a life of service, to be a teacher again, in some sense of that word, to teach writers and readers what was possible, what stories could still be discovered and shared. And it meant so much to me that when Mr. Conroy passed away, I left the world of publishing behind and came here to Beaufort to help run our nonprofit, then startup, Pat Conroy Literary Center. Now we're in our 5th year, and I'm coming to you tonight from a building that we own, our 3rd location. It's been just a remarkable amount of growth in a handful of years, and it's a great pleasure to be here to get to share some of those stories. Talk about some of the writers who meant a lot to Pat and who still mean a lot to me as well tonight, and where those traditions come from. So thank you all so much for being here.
So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about how Southern literature really defines us as Southerners, including us transplants. I think I'm still referred to. I've only been down here 20 some years, so I might still be a damn Yankee from Chicago, but so Joe, kick us off with this.
So, when we talk about Southern literature, and we have to talk about, as you said, what really defines us. And first of all, it's the land as a rich literary tradition. And then secondly is what happened to just bend an entire genre around a region. And of course, that goes into why Southern literature matters, not only from the beginnings, but now and into the future. But it's all about the culture. And as I like to say, from the Black Loam of the Mississippi Delta to the languid low country of South Carolina, the crushing poverty of Appalachia, and to the sweltering heart of Cracker, Florida, our literary traditions rival and even surpass that of other parts of the country. And you say, well, why is that? And we have to look to the people first. The South has a very rich literary tradition that's born not of just one culture, but a mix of cultures. And it started with our Celtic ancestors, those coming from Scotland and Ireland, and a lot of them settled in Appalachia. They brought with them thousands of years of a storytelling tradition. And nowadays, there is some scholarly research on it that a lot of scholars now believe that were it not for the Celtic tradition, there wouldn't be any such thing as Southern literature. And I myself am of Irish heritage, and I've been to Ireland a number of times and listened to the storytellers. And if you sit around and listen to people tell stories in Ireland, you could easily be sitting in a truck stop in South Georgia listening to the same thing. And of course, the indigenous people of the region of the Southeast, and I think more in terms of the Creek, the Cherokee, and the Seminole. I mean, they had a storytelling tradition that went back eons. But for the Cherokee and their written language, there was no written language with the other tribal peoples. So by necessity, they told stories. And of course, the slaves and indentured servants, the people coming from Africa on the slave ships, they brought their own stories with them from their motherland, and they had no choice but to tell stories, because in those days it was a crime to teach a Black person how to read and how to write. So the only way they could get their stories passed on was through the oral tradition. And so you ask yourself, well, what did all these people have in common? What brought us to the point where we are now? Well, first of all, literacy was a luxury. Not everybody could read and write, obviously. So the stories that were told got passed on from family to family and from generation to generation. And they just got better and better. And I think one of the things I think about when I think about the storytelling tradition in the South is the game of telephone we used to play when we were kids. And you'd sit around and you'd whisper something in your friend's ear, and that friend would whisper it to the next kid and the next kid and the next kid. And by the time it got to the end of the classroom or the group you were in, it bore no resemblance whatsoever to the original story, and quite often was even better, because Southerners do what are called tales.
Jonathan, weigh in on that a little bit, because I know a lot of us all proudly wear our Pat Conroy Tell Me a Story pin. What Pat had definite thoughts on that as well, yeah?
Did actually. Let me see if
There
I
you
can-
go.
There it is, yes.
I have mine here somewhere, but I can't find it.
Pat believed wholeheartedly you should never let the truth get in the way of a good story, and says that, in fact, in Beach Music. I think there's an exchange between Jack McCall and his daughter, in which Jack defends his exaggerations by saying stories don't have to be true, they only have to help. And that's very often the spirit of exaggeration. It begins, when and where does it begin? In 1608, right? Arguably the very first entry into Southern literature, Captain John Smith's accidents and occurrences in Virginia, in which he tells the story of being rescued by Pocahontas, and everything is an exaggeration, if not an outright lie in those stories, but told from a perspective that he's trying to motivate some action. So, in Conroy's language, he's trying to help. And that's always been a part of the Southern tradition. Pat was deeply invested in these ideas because he grew up as a child of abuse with a mother who learned to tell stories to disguise that abuse. He grew up in a house of fiction in so many ways. So it's very much a part of his world. It's very much a part, for different reasons, of the lives of all Southerners, as Joe so aptly stated.
Yeah, because it's fascinating to me, and honestly, it never really occurred to me until Joe wrote that brilliant blog post that eventually became this presentation. Even about that, there is no Midwestern fiction per se. There is no well, there's Westerns, but that's a different sort of thing. There is no, Northeast fiction per se, but Southern genre is a whole genre in its own thing. So, so that brings me to this great line of Joe's. I love this.
So we continued to lay on our most casual conversations as thick as cane syrup on cornbread. And when writing became more available, the storytellers who had things to say got it said, but they got it said in writing now so that everybody could participate.
So we're going to move into talking a little bit about that royalty. I just blew the slide, but we don't want to go back. Let's see. We can go back one. Yeah.
The
because
royalty
this
of the
was
South.
actually, I wanted to, yeah, exactly. Etched in granite and laid as the cornerstone of every school and library. So I'm just gonna let you guys just riff on this a little. Let's just talk about some folks with some of the trailblazers.
Well, 1920 to 1930 was called the Southern Renaissance. And it was sort of the birthplace of Southern literature, because out of that came Faulkner, Woolf, Margaret Mitchell, Erskine Caldwell. There was a Black author, his name was Charles Chestnut. He wasn't recognized as part of the Southern Renaissance, but he was one of the very first Black authors to write Southern fiction. So these people, they jumped out there, before that what was quote unquote Southern fiction was sort of a reminiscing about the lost cause and, the old South. But these writers came out and started challenging all these preconceived notions. And the stuff they began to write was quite often critical of the South and pointed out the flaws in the system and everything else. And of course, then the next generation of authors who came after that picked up the torch. And we're talking the Flannery O'Connors and the Eudora Weltys and the Harper Lees and that bunch. They just picked up this torch and carried it. And of course, they led it into the modern, our modern day authors. And, some of, we've talked about earlier, of course, the first one that comes to mind to me is, of course, Pat Conroy. But there's so many more. I mean, you have Alex Haley and Maya Angelou, and there's just so many of them. It's just impossible to count them all.
To Joe's point, in the Southern Renaissance, we really start to see a group of writers who are not only trying to chronicle the South, but as Joe so aptly stated, trying to critique it, trying to change it ultimately, trying to change us, trying to change Southerners. And they're doing it on this grand epic scale, even though the physical location they may be describing may ultimately be very small, a boarding house for Thomas Wolfe, like a single county, Yoknapatawpha County for Faulkner. But it's what we now call world building, universe building. For Flannery O'Connor, it's going deeply into the imagination of sometimes just a single person. Eudora Welty comes to do the same thing too. But in the vastness of that space, whether it's physical space or intellectual space, they're able to really delve deeply into the traditions of the South, try and figure out this conflict between the past and the present, between what was, what is, and what they wish would be. And writers like Pat Conroy come out of that tradition. Writers like Ron Rash come out of that tradition. Writers like so many folks who we can name right now and are reading right now are coming out of that and responding to it and trying to expand it even farther.
When I still lived in Chicago, the first Pat Conroy book that I had read was The Lords of Discipline. And based on reading that book, I had to come down here and visit Charleston, and eventually chose to move here because of it. And the reason that I fell in love with the city was actually through Pat's words and through his vision and his perspective. And again, what you say of trying to balance that past and present, but also this dichotomy of what was sad and bad and needed changing in the South versus this incredible beauty of it, and that he could hold those two things together.
Mm-hmm.
and write them both beautifully made me want to see this city. Just I had to know what this city was that could hold that kind of fascination for both the good and the bad.
Yeah, it's
so
a
can you talk a little bit about this book, Jonathan? So Jonathan has won all sorts of awards for editing this particular work, and we've sold a whole bunch of them at the bookstore, of course. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
This is definitely a team effort, so not my book alone. This is a book that Nicole Seitz and I edited together with 67 writers who knew Pat Conroy at some point during the roughly 50-year span of his writing life. So we were all befriended or mentored or championed by Pat in some way, and many of the writers in this book were actually published by Pat, so championed by him in that sense as well. But it includes, not that it's limited to Southern writers at all, but it includes this incredible pantheon of writers who are trying, indeed succeeding in defining and redefining the South right now. Folks like Rick Bragg, who is probably one of the most recognizable Southern writers of this moment and has been for a good long stretch. Ron Rash, who I mentioned earlier, who Pat always referred to as Mr. Big, because he thought he would be the next big thing. And George Singleton, who had this really complex relationship with Pat Conroy, but is a brilliant master at critiquing the South, at both describing the South as it is, but very much mocking it for the things that can change and should change. Tony Grooms, brilliant African-American writer from Georgia, winner of the Lillian Smith Award twice, for writing those same kinds of books that both document and challenge the South. And then not that the whole list should be male on the other end of this. We have folks like Mary Alice Monroe and Patty Callahan Henry, neither of whom are native-born Southerners, but have become wonderfully well-known and deservedly so, Southern writers, writers of Southern traditions. Nikki Finney, one of South Carolina's 2 National Book Award-winning poets, daughter of the state's first African-American Supreme Court Chief Justice, had quite a lot to say about the South that she experienced as well and came into Conroy's circle. And 2 of Pat's own students, not in the sense that I'm Pat's students, but in the literal classroom sense of being Pat's students, have gone on to become very well-known, very well-respected writers as well. One is Valerie Sayers from right here in Beaufort. The other is Sally Ann Robinson, one of Pat's students from Defusky Island. Pat told those kids on Defusky, those 18 kids, that literature, that reading and writing was a way to freedom, and freedom was everything. So Sally Ann grew up knowing that she wanted to get from being a storyteller in the oral tradition, which was the tradition of the island, to being able to do it in writing, which is a skill that Conroy brought into her world. And that's 9 out of 67. It's an incredible group of writers who came into Pat's circle because he always thought the spotlight was meant to be shared. It was never meant for him alone. And that's what the book reflects. That there can even be a book is remarkable. That you can live a life as a writer, have an internationally successful career for roughly 50 years, pass away and have 67 people still like you. That's pretty good in itself, I would say. But to have them want to share nice things about you in a way that will motivate the next generation and the generation after that to continue being storytellers and writers. And the book has been a remarkable experience, continues to be a remarkable experience because of the writers it's brought into my life who are already a part of Pat's circle.
Outstanding. Oops.
Yeah, he literally sowed literal kudzu in the Low Country. I mean, Pat's influence in the Low Country in the literary tradition, I'm always amazed. Every time I turn around, there's a new author coming out of the Low Country area there. It's just such a hotbed of literature now.
Yeah, very much so. Well, I'm just seeing a lot of these folks on here of the women Southern writers who are very popular. I know that.
Yeah, the Fab Females.
The Fab Females, yeah, Nicole Seitz. I did an amazing panel with Nicole Seitz and Bren McLean and J.C. Sasser, who wrote Gretelbird, at the Pulpwood Queens Book Club Festival a few years back. We did a panel on Southern Gothic, and it was so much fun, so much to talk about. But that was right when Bren's book had just been published, and that was actually the last book to be chosen, correct, Jonathan, by Pat?
Nicole's
for the Story River.
Nicole's was the last to be chosen.
Nicole's was the last. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Very good. Yeah. Amazing. But some other great ones to come out of there too. Trouble the Water, Rebecca Dwight Bruff. She's been Yeah, she's down there in Beaufort. She was up in Somerville for an event too, and folks are loving her book. I loved it myself because again, before moving here, and growing up in the North, I had no idea who Robert Smalls was, no idea whatsoever, and was ashamed that I had no idea. But again, something not taught in schools, and so that's another thing that so much of this Southern literature has done for us is taught the things that weren't necessarily mainstreamed. Yeah.
Mhm.
Every so often, the South will have a story that will find its storyteller. And I think, Becky is a good example of that, of being the chronicler of Robert Smalls. Not that she is the only one, but she is a brilliant one. Same thing happened with Eliza Lucas Pinckney when Natasha Boyd wrote The Indigo Girl. Once again, Southern story just dying for a novel, waiting for the right novelist to find it. And Natasha was that writer.
There you go. Yeah. And Cigar Factory.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
here I was going to, Merck and Mash for coffee for forever at the Cigar Factory. And back before that, we'd go to Theater 99 over there. Had no idea of the history of that. Fascinating. Incredible. And then I have to mention, she's on the slide here, and I don't get to talk about her enough, but Cassandra King Conroy herself,
Mhm.
who's amazing. And Moonrise, I put that up. That's my favorite. That's my
Oh,
favorite.
mine too.
Oh, such a fun book. But she's a force as well, and has kind of definitely carried on in the tradition of just being so generous and loving and good to other writers as well.
Well,
You know,
Cassandra and Pat
Janice,
never forgot what it was like to start out when you have, nobody on your side and you're not even sure you can do it, when you're not even ready to admit to taking the claim that you are a writer. They never forgot what that was like, and the fact that they were teachers really inspires Cassandra to this day to be so generous with her fellow writer.
Mhm.
Oh, here's some pictures of some of the girls. So there's Brian McLean, and then Michelle that wrote Cigar Factory, and that is
That is Catherine Clark on
Catherine,
the
right.
end there. Yeah. So, one of the many things I've gotten to do, thanks to Pat Conroy, is be a judge for the annual Willie Morris Award for Southern Fiction, which honors just an incredible group of writers. And the reason I get to be a judge, the reason I owe that to Pat, is because only 2 university press books have ever won that award, and Pat and I published both of them. And one of them was Bren McLean's One Good Mama Bone, and the other was Catherine Clark's The Headmaster's Darlings. So now I get to pay that forward by helping other writers be selected as winners of that award. And this year it was Deshaun Charles Winslow, debut novelist for a brilliant book called In West Mills, writer out of North Carolina. My God, that book deserves every good thing that happens to it. It's wonderful.
What's
thing.
the name of that book again?
In West Mills.
In West Mills.
It
Okay.
won the Center for Fiction Award for debut novel. The year before it won the Willie Morris Award. Just incredible. Deshaun's a great guy too.
Outstanding. Well, I'm ashamed to say I haven't read Headmasters yet either, so I'm gonna have to have more books on the list. There you go. All right, let's talk about the real men here, Joe.
The Manly Men. Now, when I think about, the people who bring intense, particularly humor to the page, the first one I think about, of course, is Rick Bragg. I mean, my God, what a force that guy is. But there's also somebody else that doesn't get talked about very much. He wasn't really a novelist, but he wrote a lot of books. But he wrote a newspaper column for the Atlanta Constitution for the longest time. His name was Louis Grizzard. The guy had the magic touch with storytelling. He could tell you a story that would make you laugh. He could tell you a story in the very next paragraph that would make you cry. And in the paragraph after that, it'd make you so mad you just wanted to slap somebody upside the head. I mean, the guy was so good, and he died way too early. It was just tragic that he had to pass away so soon. But there's some really good Native American authors out there who get forgotten a lot. There's a couple of books about the Eastern Cherokee by some Native American authors. They don't get a lot of notice as Southern authors because quite a few of them are descendants of the Eastern Band Cherokee, and they live in Oklahoma and places like that. But they tell stories about the Southern tradition with their people. So there's some really good stuff in there that I discovered over the time that I was doing a lot of research for my blog. I thought, God, I got some Native American authors I really need to read. And this one that's up on the screen, Where the Dead Sit Talking, I haven't read it yet, I confess, but it's supposed to be a fantastic novel. So I can't wait to read that one.
Outstanding.
I see Silas House on that screen as well, representing great Commonwealth of Kentucky, and one of many writers really trying to capture the queer South, which hasn't always had that many voices. Sean Charles Winslow, who I mentioned earlier, and Nikki Finney, who I mentioned earlier, certainly part of that as well. But Silas is just doing an amazing job on that front as advocate, educator, writer, as everything. We were honored to host him about this time last year, a little bit later in the fall, as part of our Low Country Book Club convention. He had been selected by Wiley Cash's Open Canon Book Club, which is really dedicated to elevating voices that don't always get heard otherwise. And Silas was part of that group, and it was a great honor for us to have him be with us.
Oh, and Wiley Cash, another fun author.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
He does a lot for other authors too. He really takes it forward. He takes up a lot of time with up and coming.
Yeah, he's been doing he heads up SEBA, the Southern Independent Booksellers Association. We do a lot of virtual events through SEBA. Started with the pandemic, but it's kept up and on, and he runs those, and he's done an amazing job and brought just a lot of talent to the table that, sadly, otherwise, especially in this past painful year, might not have gotten noticed and brought to the fore. So that's the beauty part of having anything to do with the book industry, is that, authors help each other out. It's just an amazing thing. It's something you do not see in other worlds and other industries. That makes it a lot of fun. So. So with that, I'm going to actually stop sharing while we get to discussion a little bit. And I wanted to tell y'all too, before I move off the screen, and I'm going to put some actual links up because I can't access them and be full screen at the same time. I don't have the technology. But today and tomorrow on our bookshop page, and a portion of these proceeds will go to the Pat Conroy Literary Center. You can order your books from us on the bookshop page. We've created several lists of contemporary men, contemporary women, trailblazing men and women who are no longer with us. And you can get any book there of not just those, but millions of titles. And they're doing take a bite out of things. So today and tomorrow, not only do you get the 10% off, but you do get free shipping. So if y'all are looking for something, and you're not near the store, or you just want to shop from comfort of home, have at it. All right. So with that, I'm going to escape out of here. Y'all can unmute yourselves, and who wants to be the brave one to start asking a question?
Jump right in the fire, somebody. Come on.
Go ahead and unmute, Cyril. You're still muted, Cyril. Unmute.
All right.
There you go. There you go.
You got it.
These are great titles and great authors, and I'm very impressed with Southern storytelling, largely getting some of it through my brother-in-law and sister-in-law, who are folklorists in West Virginia, who there are just a lot of stories about the mines and the people. And so starting there was a first taste of it. So I don't really have a question. I'm processing all this because I'm new here to South Carolina. And so I don't really have a question, but this is all fascinating, and I can't wait to order some books. That's it for now.
Right.
But thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing this.
And I
I
have
mean,
a
it is a
question.
lot to process. It really is. I mean, it's just, I mean, it's like we started out the discussion. It's not just one thing. It's this great big huge ball that just started rolling down the hill like a snowball, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's like Sherry said at the very beginning. I mean, sure, there's Northwestern literature, and but none of it is as defined as Southern literature.
Right.
I do have
Yeah.
a question. I'm a fan of fried green tomatoes, Fanny
Oh,
Fry.
yeah.
Yep.
Taking, and when I'm thinking about it now in the context of what y'all are talking, where'd that come from?
There you are.
Welcome to
It's
here.
here. It's not just a Southern story, but she mixes it with women's issues.
Mhm.
So she's got, and it looks like a lot of these authors in the collage that you presented of the book covers seem to do that. They'll take that Southern tablecloth, if you will, and set the table with a variety of things, of issues that are not just old time storytelling, but contemporary issues. So this is great. This is something to think about. So,
well, if you were a woman in the South, you struggled with those issues, and you know, it's like stories that my aunts, you know, I grew up as a little kid, and where I would just sneak in and sit quiet and listen to stuff. I mean, it's amazing. And from, I don't care, like if you were one of the wealthier families, or it was the same thing almost in every house, you know. So that is part of the Southern.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know Mandy Haynes, Mandy is the executive director of the Pulpwood Queens book club, which is the largest book club on the planet. We're proud to have a chapter at Main Street Reads in Somerville, but some of our authors on the line, including Kat Varn, and Scott Boyer, and our own Joe Palmer, are, and I think Robert too, Robert Gwaltney, yeah, have been selected as Pulpwood Queens picks, which is a pretty big F deal, yeah? So very, very cool. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Mandy. And I actually have a question from Robert Gwaltney via the chat. And I'm going to throw this one to Jonathan, since you definitely have your finger on the pulse of so many different authors out there. Robert asks, what do you feel is the future of Southern fiction?
Well, that's a great question, Robert.
Yeah.
Well, you know, well, as the only beloved genius on the call, I'll happily answer this. You know, and let me frame it in terms of what I've been reading recently, what I'm seeing right now in books that I've been reviewing and authors that we've been hosting. When Conroy was writing, when so many people, you know, who sort of think of on that level and of that time period, they were striving for this timelessness, to write about all times and all people and all places, maybe to extract that from their personal experiences and from the moments in which they lived and were writing, but really trying to get to this sense of timelessness. I'm actually seeing less of that in Southern writing. I'm seeing people responding to the moment we're in, because the moment we're in warrants response. It warrants action, and writers and artists in every sense, literary or otherwise, want to be a part of reshaping what we've seen go wrong lately. And I'm thinking of two books in particular, although they are representative of many on my shelf. One I just reviewed this past weekend for the Charleston Post and Courier, comes out, I think, in 2 weeks. Jason Mott, a writer based in North Carolina, has got a brilliant book called Hell of a Book, which, you know, he spent about 8 years working on the structure of it. I think I have that right, 8 years, maybe a little less than that. But what really prompted it, and what's the more interesting layer of the book, is a response to the Black Lives Matter movement, is a response to police violence against African-American communities as a response to things that are happening right now that feels, everything about that book feels raw and immediate because of that. And then there's a book published by our friends at Hub City right here in South Carolina called Departed Earth, and Jolly and Jetty, a writer from Atlanta right now, who just had another book come out, a book of nonfiction called Southbound, which is really about the immigrant experience in the South as it's unfolding right now, as it's being challenged and changing and affecting lives above and beyond the immigrant communities. And both of those books, even though I'm sure they took a long time in the making in some aspects, the heart of them, the motivation for them are right now. They feel incredibly relevant in this moment. And I'm seeing more and more of that from Southern writers too, who don't just want to try and figure out the past of the South, but want to shape the future of the South. And this is the toolkit they have to do that.
Very good.
I think one of the commonalities about Southern literature, and we've discussed this before, and it's really, really evident, particularly in Pat Conroy's writing. In fact, the theme of the first Pat Conroy Literary Festival was places, character, and muse, because Southern literature is rooted in a sense of place. And that sense of place literally becomes a character in the story. It's not just like you're pointing over there and saying, well, there's Tom's Seafood Shack. Southern writers take you inside the seafood shack and let you smell the grease that they're frying the fish with. You don't always get that in other kinds of writing. There's some beautiful literature out there, but oftentimes it falls a little flat because you don't get drawn into that sense of place that's so rich. I mean, it's like Pat Conroy's quote, my wound is geography. I mean, and it's all of our wounds. It really is.
Ron Rash has a novel called The World Made Straight that includes a line, may even begin with this line actually, landscape is destiny, right? Which is sort of his version of my wound is geography. But in Ron's world, and certainly in Pat's world, destiny can be changed. We are creatures entrusted with free will. So yes, our place is the core of much of our experience, but we can change that experience and we can change that place. And that's what I see writers of the very modern South, of the immediately modern South, trying very hard to do.
It's like Silas House was Southernmost.
Yes.
I loved that so much.
Yes, absolutely. Another great example.
Yeah, the novel you just mentioned from Ron Rash, The World Made Straight, that's my very favorite novel of his. I mean, I just loved it. I've read it like 3 times now. And they also made a movie out of it that was quite good too.
Yeah, of the Ron Rash novels and stories that have been made into movies, that's the good one. World Made Straight.
Good one, yeah.
Well, I think too, being
Joe,
Southern and sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So what you were saying about sometimes like maybe the other stories fall flat, but how geography, I'm from Tennessee, born and raised in Tennessee. I live in Florida now, but I worked at Vanderbilt in Nashville, Tennessee, but almost all of my coworkers were, except for a couple, were from other states, and they would pick on me for being so Southern. And I did cardiac ultrasound, so I was in the room with the families and the kids, so talking a lot, that helped. The kids would, I'd talk, make stories the whole time I'm working and stuff, and people would say, they'd fuss a little bit and say, we don't have time to play. Well, I didn't take that. You'd look at our studies, I wasn't taking longer. It just seemed like I was because I was having fun. But it's like geography, it is funny. Like they think that Southern people are nosy. We're not nosy. We are interested.
We're interested. We really
We're
are.
interested.
Yeah. And we can make good stories out of things. I mean, I had coronary bypass surgery 3 summers ago this summer. And my youngest, one of my grandsons, not my youngest grandson, is a worried type person about people's health and things. And he was terrified that I was going to die because his dad said Papa had a heart attack and he had to have surgery for it. And so he came over one day and he just sat there looking at me, and I said, "What's the matter?" And he goes, "Are you going to die, Papa?" And I said, "Of course not." And he wanted to know, well, what happened to your heart? And so I just made up off the cuff a story about getting in a sword fight with Blackbeard's ghost. And I just ran with it. And he thought it was the coolest thing. And I guess a few days later, his mom got a call from one of the teachers at school talking about he was sort of holding forth on his papa's sword fight with Blackbeard. But it works, like Mandy says, you can use those as teaching moments and to allay fears and worries, like a small child, like you're saying. You want to distract them somehow, and storytelling is a great way to do it.
And it works great with adults too.
And it does. We're all professional liars.
One of the first lessons Pat taught me was to speak in stories, to not just get to the point, that the story was the point, the journey was the point, narrative was the point. And stories take place in that in-between space between the thing that starts it and the things that ends it. Southern language, the idiosyncratic nature of Southern speech is loaded with words that do that slow down time, that are undefined. Where is it? It's over yonder. That's not a measurable distance. That's the space in between. What are we doing? We're fixing to get ready. That's an in-between space as well, right? Are you going to do it or are you not going to do it? I reckon. What is that? That's not a yes or a no. That's in between, right? Our language is loaded with that. The Southern lexicon is loaded.
Do it directly.
With these one-word stories, these things that kind of happen in this in-between space. And that's where stories happen. That's where narrative happens.
Yeah.
Right.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Terry. Go ahead.
Oh, that's all right. I was listening, Joe, when you were talking about Southern literature being rooted in a place and how it becomes a character. And I was writing, "My wound is geography," as you said it. And that quote to me of Pat Conroy's, it speaks to me, I think, it probably in a different way than it does to other people, because I was a military child and a military spouse. And so when I hear "my wound is geography," it's the wound of not being rooted in a particular place.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, Jonathan, if you can speak to, was that ever an issue for Pat? I feel like he's spent a lot of his time in the South and he had roots in the South. But is that, I feel like it doesn't mean to him what it means to me when I hear that quote.
Well, remember that line isn't said by Pat Conroy, it's said by Tom Wingo, fictional character.
Right.
Pat gave Tom the boyhood that Pat didn't have. Pat was like you, a military brat. He grew up in placelessness without a sense of hometown. And it was his mother, Peg Conroy, who said, well, that means you get to pick any hometown you want. That's what the Marine Corps is going to give you. And Pat picked Beaufort. So when he wanted to sort of imagine what it would be like to have grown up in one place his entire boyhood, gives that gift to Tom Wingo, who speaks that sentence, and not Pat Conroy. Pat's world was very much like yours, Terry, and he wrote about that too. He's got a brilliant piece about being a military brat, which I'm sure you've read. It's reprinted in My Reading Life, but that's not where it originally appeared. It was a foreword to a collection of essays about the military brat experience.
Oh, so besides Lords of Discipline, my first book, and Water is Wide, which because I just love the concept. My Reading Life is probably my other favorite Pat Conroy book. And if anyone hasn't read it, even if you don't know Pat or his work yet, read My Reading Life, because it is such a journey. It becomes your own journey. And it doesn't take long for it to do that. When I and I was always like between first and third in line for every Pat Conroy signing after I moved down here, and couldn't wait to get my hands on that book. But the beauty of it is it talks about all the different writing that influenced him, not just in his writing, but in his life throughout the course. And as you start reading it, you'll just go, oh my God, yeah, no, I remember. Oh, and then, oh yeah, and I read this and I completely love that. And so you start your own journey and discover your own reading life as you're going along in it. I thought it was just brilliantly done.
You
That
know,
was one of,
I'm sorry.
oh, sorry, good. I
Another
was gonna say,
sleeper hit for, I'm sorry, go ahead. There's a time delay here and I messed up.
I was gonna say Sherry critiques a lot of my work, and the line that she constantly drilled into me when I first started writing was, "Don't tell me, show me."
Mhm.
And one of the things that I've been very blessed at, people that don't know me, is that they say, "You really take me into the moment." You know, like you said, you can smell the fish fry, or you can see the pain on. But I grew up military, so as well, my parents were career military parents, and you're so moving all the time that your connection is with, for me, was the book, the story, because I didn't have a hometown. I didn't, we were constantly uprooting, so I'd escape into the secret garden or Gone with the Wind, or those were my best friends, or my books. So,
And Kat's latest book, she's working on a new one now, but the one that came out before this nonsense, pre-nonsense, was called Gardenia Duty, an amazing book if you haven't read it yet. And again, you get that same, see, I always akin Kat's family is sort of, she's the girl version of Pat, because she grew up, in a family of 4 girl military brats. But again, that nostalgia of that, that kind of Cold War time and stuff, and all the silly things that we used to do when we were kids, and chasing mosquito trucks and all that. So if you're of a certain age, 20, then it's a book you will completely love and adore. And again, another one that you'll go, oh, yeah, I did that. I think that's the beauty of so much of the fun Southern fiction too, is that Southern fiction, more so than a lot of others, to me, what I've noticed is it's raw. It tends to be, Bren's is a great example of that as well. It's raw, it's direct, and it gets kind of in you. But because of that rawness and that authenticity and that realness, it also resonates, and it's something that people carry with them a lot more, I think, because they will resonate with a certain character or a certain situation, or the honesty of, oh my God, yeah, I've been in that fix, that you see a lot more.
One of Pat's books that was a sleeper hit for me, and I look at all of them now, and it has actually ended up being one of my very favorites, is the one about, the title just got away from me, doggone it, My Losing Season. My God, I hated basketball. I still hate basketball. I can't get interested in basketball. I was the tall, skinny kid in school, and all the coaches were trying to get me to play basketball. I just wasn't interested. And everybody kept saying, you got to read My Losing Season. You got to read My Losing Season. And I would tell people, I don't think even Pat Conroy could write a good book about basketball. And then I read it, and my God, what a lesson. It's not just a good story. It's this beautiful lesson about adversity and loss being a teacher. In fact, I think he's quoted somewhere as saying there's no greater feeling than victory, but no greater teacher than loss. I'm sort of paraphrasing there. Our youngest son played football for a little Division III college up in Ohio, and they had the number 4 rated defense of all colleges, all divisions combined, but their offense sucked. And their coach just couldn't get them there. It wasn't because they had bad players. They were loaded with talent. But it was like Pat's coach at the Citadel. He just didn't know how to take them to that level. And of course, all the kids suffered from it. So I gave that book to my son. And I said, you really, really need to read this because this is your story.
Mm.
Yeah, that's,
So Joe, tell me, tell us a little bit more about The Mariner's Tale. Not to me, obviously, I've read it, but tell folks a little bit more about The Mariner's Tale and tell me what you're working on now.
Well, A Mariner's Tale is a story about loss and hope and redemption and all these other things combined. It's a story about this wayward kid who's in trouble and off trouble, who crosses paths with this cynical old sailor who owns a marina. And the sailor has been building, Jack Merkel, the mariner, has been building a sailboat that he started with his own wife and son 10 years prior to that. And of course, he lost them tragically. And along comes this kid, breaks into his boatyard one night, and in a fit of rage, because he falls down off the ladder trying to climb on this boat, picks up a 5-pound ball peen mallet and just proceeds to beat the dickens out of this boat and badly damages it. And when he's arrested for it, the sheriff brings him in for Merkel to identify on the videotape, the surveillance tape. And of course he does. And the kid is super hostile, just nasty. But Merkel sees something kind of skirting around the edges of this kid's vision, that here's somebody who's never had a chance. Never. He's just been a product of the system. So he takes this kid in. He's old school. He'd rather have a pound of flesh, for the recompense than see you go to jail. I mean, it was like that when I was a kid. If you got caught vandalizing the water tower, like I did one time, you got sent to the fire station to wash fire trucks. You worked your punishment off, and it was horrible. But he takes this kid in basically just to work off his punishment with the idea in mind that when he does, he'll go back to the court. The judge is a friend of his, the sheriff's a friend of his. And so he'll go back and prevail upon them to cut this kid some slack. Well, ultimately, he becomes this kid's mentor and father figure. And it's the old thing about, when you're trying to help somebody else, a lot of times you end up helping yourself. So that's the story. And, there's a chapter in Ireland that I went to Ireland to do the research for. And when I was done with it, of course, I have a lot of friends there, and Irish American friends here. And when I got done with that chapter, I just sent it to them. And I said, everybody take a shot at this and, tell me what works, tell me what doesn't work, because I want this to be right. So anyway, that's the story of A Mariner's Tale. The one I'm writing now is called Of Locusts and Wild Honey. And of course, you may recognize that, from the Gospel of Matthew. John goes into the desert and eats locusts and wild honey. But it's a story about these 5 misfit kids coming of age in the turbulent 60s, who just cast their lot with each other. They're just outcasts from their peer group. And they cast their lot with each other and take a blood oath never to be apart from each other. And of course, it's like John Lennon said, fate's what happens when you're making other plans. And it doesn't work out that way for them. And the story begins with, I'm telling it in the first person, and I'm really, really enjoying doing this because it feels more like storytelling. But the story begins with Denny Kershaw, the main character narrator's helicopter crashing into the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. And then, of course, it segues into the next chapter where they're playing in the river as children. And there's a lot of different themes going on there too. What I'm trying to do with that one is to not only tell the story about these kids, but to do a little Forrest Gump thing there and kind of work in the events of the time, that are going on, because I think those kinds of things are important. So I'm like 16 chapters into it, and I'm feeling pretty good about it.
Well, that's a nice segue into the Vietnam bit. So, Pat, Jonathan, don't you have an event coming up this Thursday? 100 Days of Vietnam virtual event. Is that this Thursday?
It is
Yeah.
this Thursday, yeah, and I understand those authors were just there with you in Somerville recently. This is
They were last Thursday for third Thursday, and they were great. It was a lot of fun. Books getting a lot of early attention.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a father-son team, Joseph and Matthew Talon, and Lieutenant Colonel Joe Talon is the subject of the memoir, and his son Matt has helped him tell the story. And it's Matt, the son, who will be hosting the virtual event this Thursday night, live streamed on our Conroy Center Facebook page, 6 p.m. local time. But you can also go to our website, sign up to be in the Zoom room like we are right now. But we're looking forward to it. We're doing an author event or a workshop, usually once a week, sometimes twice a week, as is the case this week. And it's just amazing to see the number of people we continue to reach, I should say, who are nowhere near Beaufort, South Carolina, but have still found their way into the Conroy Center circle in one way or another.
Yeah, that's
And
great.
I really have to,
That's really great.
I got to give a big shout out to the Conroy Center and the Conroy Festival, because I wouldn't be where I am right now with my novel without them. I made so many connections.
That's where we first met too.
It
was at
was.
that first event.
It was. And
Brent and I were teaching a class there.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. And
Yeah.
when I got time, I got to the point where I needed an editor, and I didn't know who to go to as a professional editor. And I was taking one of Stephanie Austin Edwards' sessions, and she was talking about the editing process. And I went to her afterwards and I said, I need an editor. My story is done. Marley Rusoff read it. She loved it, but she said, you got to have an editor here. And so Stephanie said, well, if you can get her, Judy Goldman Kurtz is the editor you need to have. And so she gave me her contact information, and I came home and emailed her. And she responded right back. I was very fortunate because the next project she was taking backed out. And so she had a hole in her calendar at that moment. So, and it was just all serendipitous, but it's been such a great experience. I mean, the support, that you get, the honest critiquing that you get from other people. Jonathan honored me last year by inviting me to come and, take part in a guest panel, at the event. I just can't say enough good about the Conroy Center and the Conroy Festival for all they've done for me, and I'm sure for everybody else. I've been going to the Conroy Festival since the very first one. My wife had to drive me to the third one because I just had heart surgery, and my doctor wouldn't let me drive. And I said, I am not missing this. So I cajoled Pam into driving me up, and my doctor was okay with that as long as she was with me. But she made friends, and so now she looks forward to going every year. So thank you, Jonathan. I mean, it's just awesome what you've done for everybody. We got Scott and Robert. We haven't heard from y'all here. Jump in.
Robert's the one that weighed in with the awesome question earlier, but I know Scott must have an awesome
I missed
one.
it. I'm sorry.
But he's the one that was talking about the future. Robert was asking about the future of
That was a
fiction.
great question.
Yes, thank you. I remember now.
Yeah. Come on, Scotty.
I'm here. You guys all know I'm the odd man out, right? For those of you who don't know me, I was born and raised in Santa Monica, California. I'm as LA as they get in terms of being a native Angelino. I've had very little experience or exposure to the South. I visited a friend in Dallas, and of course I was there for the Pulpwood Queen event. So a couple years ago, so I had a chance to see it. I don't know if this is going to work itself into a question, but I guess what my mind keeps coming back to is how being a Southerner, or the South in general, has it's got its own culture, its own heritage, its own history that's so distinct that it provides essentially a platform. It's a launching point for stories. I mean, obviously for me, like being born in LA, I could write stories if I wanted to about Hollywood, the movie scene and all the rest, because that's part of, the city that I grew up in. But to have such a deep heritage, to have so much history in the South, just it strikes me as a truly amazing phenomenon, not only because it provides this platform for these stories, but how many different directions people can go with these stories, and obviously how many different directions people have gone with these stories over the years. So, it's just a thought. I don't really have a question around it, but if anyone wants to respond to that, I'd love to hear it.
You really hit on something there, because the South was such an isolated culture for so long. I mean, it was all wrapped up in itself for so long that that's what happened. It's just now, I think, finally starting to break away from the isolation of its past and to become more open. It's been a long process. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It was a very closed society for an awful long time. And of course, that had a big influence on the kind of writing that came out of it.
Yeah.
I can relate to what you're saying, Scott, about not really feeling part of the Southern culture. I grew up partially in Oklahoma, and I thought I was from the South until I met my husband, who's from North Carolina, and he said, "That ain't the South." So when I'm with people from the South, I sound like I'm from somewhere else. When I'm with people who are not from the South, they tell me I have an accent. So I've got an accent, or I don't have an accent everywhere I go. I was thinking about, as this conversation is going on, how it's really hard to say why we have Southern literature and we don't have Midwestern literature, not to the strength of what we have in Southern literature. And it made me think. I was digging for a book that my son gave me because he's a Flannery O'Connor fan, and I have this book on mystery and manners. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to read a few things that Flannery O'Connor says about Southern literature. And she quotes Walker Percy, who, when he won the National Book Award, someone asked him why there were so many good Southern writers, and he said, "Because we lost the war." And Flannery O'Connor goes on to say, he didn't mean by that simply that a lost war makes good subject matter. What he was saying was that we have had our fall with a capital F. We have gone into the modern world with an inburnt knowledge of human limitations and with a sense of mystery which could not have developed in our first state of innocence as it has not sufficiently developed in the rest of our country. I know there's not one answer. Even Flannery O'Connor doesn't have the answer for what makes Southern literature so good, but I think that's obviously very insightful. The difficulty, the terrible things that have happened in the South have been a big part of why that's developed. Sorry, my computer's making a funky noise.
To Terry's point, and ultimately to Flannery's and Walker Percy's, there's an economic value in not just telling the story of the South, but selling the story of the South. There's a great book called Southern Land, Northern Money, or maybe Northern Money, Southern Land, one of those two things, which is sort of about an isolated time period, an isolated set of experiences in which Southern properties here in Beaufort County, most of which were historically plantation homes, were all saved from falling into the earth by folks who came down from the North with money and an interest in Southern literature and Southern history and Southern culture, because those things had been sold to them by the South, because there was a need to have an influx of money and ultimately of people, and then later of ideas into the South as well, too. And all of that can be tied directly back to the Civil War. That's where the economic collapse of the South begins and should begin. But something had to replace that. And selling heritage, selling Southern culture, selling Southern literature and Southern art and Southern cuisine, all of that became the economic drivers of the South. And I say that tonight from a town that runs on tourism. That's what keeps Beaufort, South Carolina going, tourism and the military, which are sort of interconnected in their interesting ways too. But Yeah, what Walker Person says and Flannery O'Connor's interpretation of that is absolutely accurate. So thank you for sharing that, Terry.
Very good.
Regina, is Regina
Regina
Williams
has
still
a-
here?
Yeah, Regina's here. She has a question about
Yeah, I think
did
I
music
just saw a question about music.
Yeah.
How does music influence my writing? Was that the question?
Yes.
So
Yes, that's the question.
yeah, some kinds of music really influences my writing. I mean, the kind of music that's, I mean, I love all kinds of music, particularly rock and roll, of course, but there's some kinds of music that really just strikes at my heartstrings. And the one of them that comes to mind right away that I listen to a lot of his music when I'm writing is Mark Knopfler. Of course, Knopfler was the front man for Dire Straits for so many years. And then he went on to become a solo artist. And his music has a very heavy Celtic influence, but it's just poetry. His songs are storytelling put to music. I was listening to the day that I got the idea for A Mariner's Tale. I was working on my boat and I took a break, and I plugged my stereo in and I dialed up some of Mark's music, and a song came on that I had not previously heard. It was called In the Sky. And it's about this old guy who built his own sailboat and sailed all over the ocean, hence, my sort of idea. But there are just some really beautiful lines in there. And so this old mariner now he's deaf as a post. He's standing by the fire where the poet's dreams roast. I mean, and then there's this beautiful line, a vagabond wind whispered over the bay. The songs and the laughter were carried away. And I came home that night and I told Pam, I'm going to call this novel Vagabond Wind. And that was the title of it almost up until publication. And I was talking with Marley Rusoff one day, and she said, I love that title, but I don't think it quite captures the entire arc of the story. So I changed it to A Mariner's Tale. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of Jimmy Buffett's music. He's got a great song on his album, Songs from Saint Somewhere, called The Oldest Surfer on the Beach. And of course, I'm a surfer. There are my boards right behind me. It's just a beautiful song.
He's also a music aficionado there, Regina, because I don't know if you can see behind him, but he's got a brilliant collection of
I've got
vinyl
like
back
200 albums.
That's
behind me.
exactly
Yeah.
what made me ask the question.
Yes.
There
So,
you
yeah,
go.
it does. There's a duo in North Carolina. They go by the name of Mandolin Orange, and I can't think of their names to save my soul now. But they did a cover of Bob Dylan's Spanish Boots for Spanish Leather. That's just way better than Dylan's original. And again, it's just it just tells a story. I listen to this stuff and it's very inspiring. So yeah, thank you for that question. I'm glad you
So I
asked.
have another question. Yeah, it's great. I have another question for Jonathan from Robert, and I can weigh in on this a little bit too, but Jonathan, you start. Robert asks, are you concerned about cancel culture and the potential impact upon Southern fiction?
Another good question. If you've got thoughts, Sherry, why don't you kick that one off and I'll follow you this time.
Well, yeah, I mean, I got to tell you, so after the pandemic started and then after George Floyd was murdered, there were a lot of, there were some riots and protests down here. And let me tell you, those were two very separate things. Yeah. So there were decent protests and then some rioters took over and there was a lot of damage done in the area. And I thought that would be just devastating to businesses. I thought that the whole thing would be, devastating to bookstores too. And I think that the beautiful thing that came out of that and is still coming out of it and will come out of it. And I think, Jonathan, you addressed it a little bit before too, that that, and this is part of, the evolution of Southern fiction is that Southern fiction is always addressing both the past, but the present and what we need the future to be in the South. And you're seeing more of that happen now, and you're seeing more of these sorts of events where we're just sitting around having a conversation. And we've had a lot of conversations around great books, anti-racist books, and Southern fiction. And people are wanting not just to read, I think, but read to, reading is way past entertainment now. Reading, at least for our local tribe, has really become about understanding and about having those conversations. And I think that that's super critical.
Yeah. In the midst of so many of the protests and the marches last year, by coincidence, I was interviewing on my podcast Tony Grooms, one of the Story River Books writers, a book called The Vain Conversation, and it's won multiple awards, and Tony's won more awards than any writer ever should. He's just a remarkable human being, first and foremost, but very wise in his writing and his teaching. And in the course of our conversation in that podcast, sort of talking about that moment, almost a year ago, Tony said, when the times are troubling, and I'm paraphrasing the first part because I don't remember exactly what he said, but when the times are troubling, Black people will march and white people will form book clubs. And he wasn't being facetious. He wasn't trying to be funny, but he was responding to this need that well-intentioned, liberal-minded people had to do something, but they didn't know where to start. But a book's a good place to start. So that was the same time that we were seeing all of these anti-racist books and book lists coming out from major publications and minor publications saying, so much of what you're looking for is there. Don't limit yourself to just buying the book and putting it on a shelf. Do something with that. Do something with that. But it was a moment when good ideas were being elevated. And cancel culture was part of that. There was an ebb and flow to that. But I'm much more interested and much more grateful for the elevation of conversation and the elevation of ideas that came out of that and continues to come out of that than I am concerned about what might be lost as statues and other things are taken down or demands are made that things are removed from our culture. I'm much more grateful for what's being added, for voices that are finally being heard, and I hope that continues.
Robert made a comment here. I want you to expound on that a little bit. I noticed you commented that your novel was on submission during a time of great social unrest. What did that make you think? How did you feel about that? How did you think, what kind of an impact did you think that was going to have on the publication of your novel?
Just unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So
Yes.
it was, it was, well, first of all, to be out on submission is a nerve-wracking experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I was about halfway through, and then we were in the midst of the pandemic, and then we were in the midst of social unrest. And gosh, I landed at one specific publisher, and I knew that things were changing when the editor was starting to ask a lot of questions. Is the author a minority? Would the author be open to sensitivity reads? And of course, yes to all of those things. I would certainly be open to any of those things. But I had moments of panic. I began to think, oh my God, Southern fiction might be on the decline, and this novel will never, ever see the light of day. And luckily, that wasn't the case. I do believe, I wholeheartedly agree with what Jonathan and Sherry were saying about that. I do believe that it's about, we're in a place now where we're elevating voices. And I think that it's a frightening time, but it's also an exciting time. And I think that if we continue on this path, I think we'll find ourselves certainly in a much better place. But I think that the next year or two in the world of publishing is going to be a very interesting time. So I'm curious to see where this path is going to take us.
There was Yeah, very, very, very good comments. There was a book I can't in sort of not cancel, but definitely postpone. There was a book being done here by a scholar out of Georgetown, Dwight McInvall, two women out of Charleston, Barbara and Caroline, and the book was called Alice, and it was a portrait of Alice Ravenel Yuji Smith, who was quite famous in her own right as a Charleston Renaissance. She basically pioneered the Charleston Renaissance art movement. And as a female, of course, this was unheard of. But because of her name and because, you know, the history of her family, and they had been slave owners in the past and stuff, that book was slated to come out in October. And it was being put out by Evening Post Books, which is the book publishing company of Charleston's Post and Courier. And we sat around I was working with the book. We sat around with the authors and the publishers and stuff and said, you know, now is not the time to release this book because of the history of that. She was important in her own right. She was brought up in the 20s and 30s. She was herself not a fan of those situations and you know, wanted to make a mark as an artist. But nevertheless, the timing wasn't right. And so we actually did hold that book off and released it in March instead, March of this year, to coincide with Women's History Month, and instead put that focus on it. And Jonathan Green, an amazing Charleston artist, actually did the tour of her work at the Edmondson Alston House, and it was great, and it put it in kind of a new context and new framework that and again, that was, I don't think it was canceled so much as just, you know, a new sensitivity to what's cool, what's not cool, what's appropriate, what's not.
Well, I mean, look at Rebecca Bruff, what happened to her. She wrote this beautiful story in the first person of Robert Smalls. And she tells a great story, you know, in the masculine voice. You don't hear the female voice in it, but she got a lot of pushback from the publishing industry because she's a white woman writing in the first person about a person of color. And they just didn't like it. You know, I was talking to Marley about it one day, and she said that's why she took her to Kohler, because she knew they would really enjoy the story. Marley loved it. She said this really funny thing to me. She said things have gotten so difficult that Ernest Hemingway would have a hard time finding an agent, let alone a publisher today, because the publishing company would say it was toxic masculinity. So, you know, yeah, there's a lot of that out there, and it's unfortunate. It really is.
Yeah, and that is a very good book. I understand the reticence there, because I have seen other work by authors who are basically co-opting where they shouldn't be. And so that does become an issue as well.
Oh, sure.
And it's a super sensitive subject. And I think my favorite story about that was down at a SIBA conference in Savannah a few years back. Oh God, what is her name now? Jodi Picoult. Jodi Picoult was just coming out with Small Great Things. And that book is about, it's about race. It's about a Black nurse who is accused of shouldn't be touching a white baby, because the white baby is the son of a very racist neo-Nazi kind of guy. And the baby dies, and there's a big to-do ensues, and it's based in part on some true stories. And, you know, she got up there and said, you know, she says, I had my doubts about this. She says, I knew that I always wanted to write about race, but I was a little white woman and didn't feel like I earned that right. But I always wanted to write this, you know, she'd been wanting to write the book for a long, long time. And so she actually got a group of Black women together, I think 5, maybe 6, but to go through basically every single thing in this book with her. And take her through it all. And one of the principal women just took her out doing all sorts of things, you know, shopping and to see who would watch them and all these different sorts of things. And the thing that I will never forget as long as I live is she said, you know, she sat down with that woman like the first night that they started talking, just because she was trying to gain some perspective on the situation. And she says, well, just help me, you know, help me. I need to learn this perspective. And the Black woman said to her, she says, well, let me give you a classic example. How often do you talk to your children about race? And she says, well, you know, yeah, of course I've had that conversation. She says, no, how often? She says, what? You know, I don't know, you know, a few times. And she says, every day. Every day we have that conversation. That's the difference. And I mean, wow. I mean, there was not because people, again, hadn't thought about it. We can't truly understand, but we can learn from that. And she herself said that she learned a ton just by writing it.
So that actually, I have a question now, if I may, that because that brings me to mind something that I'm curious about. Being a Southern writer, obviously, so much of this is about the culture, the heritage, the history of the South. You know, racism and you know the differences are a big part of that as well. I'm curious how much Southern authors feel a compulsion, feel that it is required to write about these subjects, to include them in your work. That if you're living in the South and you want to write a novel, like me, I mean, I write young adult, I write fantasy, I write fiction, you know, but if I don't have that pressure on me, you know, maybe Joe or maybe somebody else wants to talk about, as a Southern writer, do you feel compelled? Do you feel the need to tackle these types of subjects that are so prominent that really, you know, most people would consider to be? I'm just reading Robert's answer here.
You know, that's a good question, because I do find myself touching on that in A Mariner's Tale. A young man named Eddie Kraft, who is an African-American kid. You know, he went away to college and you know, he was a prodigy. He went away to college and played football, but you know, he got his knee completely destroyed in a championship game, and everything he loved was suddenly gone. You know, this kid, I didn't really come out and say so, but he's sort of been exploited. You know, he was just another Black kid who was good at football. And of course he had to come home and learn how to do something. And, you know, Jack Merkel, being the guy that he was, took him in. And yeah, I think you're right. I think there is a little bit of a need to address these things. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know that it's born out of a sense of guilt, although I think it can be for some people. I think, at least from my perspective, I use it as a means to just sort of address, you know, what I see going on. Because, you know, there's some things out there that just have to be addressed. And, you know, I got a good lesson from one of my sons. You know, I was raised, even though I was in, you know, a deep Southern family, I grew up, you know, Irish, you know, third generation Irish Catholic in a hick Baptist town. And, you know, the Black folks were at the bottom of the pecking order, and above those were the Jews and the Catholics. And so we sort of all had to sort of look out for each other. And my dad would beat you senseless in a heartbeat for any sort of racist language or jokes or anything like that. And so I always considered myself just to be completely colorblind. And one day I was talking with our youngest son, and I mentioned something about this Black guy at work who, you know, he was a very good friend of mine. And my son stopped me and he goes, "Why did you say Black guy?" And I said, what do you mean? He goes, this black guy at work who's a very good friend of yours. And I said, yeah, what about it? He said, why did you feel the need to say he's black? Why not just say this very good friend of yours? And it was an eye opener. It really was, because it's just something that's endemic. I mean, there's just no getting around it. I mean, we're not colorblind. And it goes back to, yeah, people of color have to have these discussions with their kids every day. I don't have to have that discussion with my kids. So yeah, it is something that I think writers in the South probably do feel a need to talk about.
Yeah, there's probably a need, and at the same time, a reticence, like how do you, I don't think that you can, unless you have something authentic to say, because on the other hand, then, there definitely is the risk right now of, again, like I said before, I am completely honest. I tend to be a little bit judgmental. There's someone in particular I'm thinking of, I'm not going to name names, but who is the farthest thing from Black that you could imagine, but is, writing about that experience, and that doesn't work for me. And it's almost, yeah, I mean, it's kind of mercenary, so there's that too. But if you have something authentic to say from your character's point of view, I don't, and that becomes a problem too, because I know that there's, and Robert mentioned that word cancel culture, and I know that when Scott was working on his first book, when he was working on Bobby Ether and the Jade Academy, he got very concerned at one point, because he had, different characters, different ethnicities of his characters. And, there were a lot of, people being publicly crucified out there. You can't write a Hispanic unless you're Hispanic, and you can't write a Black character unless you're Black and stuff. Well, what if he's got a group of friends who are all these different ethnicities? Then, what do you do? And again, he's writing YA fantasy fiction, but they were going after other YA fantasy fiction authors for just those sorts of things. So, and I used to say, well, thank God you don't have an alien in there, because where are you going to find one of those to write that instead? But I mean, so that,
That's right.
Yeah.
We talked about, I think it was the author from England, right, who had her launch pulled, had the release pulled. But I guess part of what I'm really curious about is the subject, because the subject of race seemingly is coming up quite a bit in this conversation. And of course, from a general standpoint, the topic is Southern, the South and Southern authors. Are they indelibly linked? Is it one and the same? To be Southern fiction, to be a Southern author, do you have to talk about race? What are the components? What are the elements that make, it seems to me that it has to be authentic. But I'm curious to know what really kind of defines it. Just being in the South, just being born in the South? Where's the, where's the boundary between, hey, this is a Southern author, this is a Southern piece of fiction, this is Southern work, and this is not? We had somebody who the boundaries of where they live. Who was it earlier? She said she lived in North Carolina, Oklahoma. And that's not Oklahoma, and that's not South. So yeah, depends on who you ask, right?
Yeah, and I don't think that you're compelled to. I think that, but contemporary, obviously, it's being dealt with a lot, and I don't think that you can write about the, as it was called to me when I moved down here, the recent unpleasantness without dealing with that aspect of it too in the South. But I read a lot of Southern literature that doesn't deal with race at all. But
Sherry,
it might deal with other problems.
When my character, the stepfather, was leaving Alabama due to economic pressures, and of course he was avoiding the draft, he joined the Navy as well. Because he was from Alabama, in one of my scenes, we have his chief ask, and this did exist in the old Navy, was a little bit of a racial divide, because the blacks weren't given as much promotion as some of the, more Caucasian American Indians as well. So I did put a short scene, wasn't a major thing, just to point that out. And and I could be wrong, but I think the South probably has been forced to deal with racism with the Ku Klux Klan and all that kind of history a little more than the North did. So it has been kind of a more prevalent subject matter for us down here because of the plantations and trying to, get the slaves integrated into the freedom, So I think it's a little bit more woven into our history than, say you go to California and talk about the Chinese, or go to New York or Philadelphia and talk about the Irish. We had to deal with it a little more.
Yeah, you absolutely have. Regina and I were having that conversation recently too, because she's from New York and I'm from Chicago. And, we got down here and got to tell you, we grew up thinking like everything in the South was segregated. And of course, by the time we got down here, it was like way more integrated than anything still is up north.
Right.
And so, yeah, they were never forced. The North was never forced to deal with that. So, the solution in Chicago is there's neighborhoods. Yeah. There's a black neighborhood, the German neighborhood, and an Irish neighborhood, and the Sicilian neighborhood, and the Hispanic neighborhood. And, that unfortunately is the cause for a lot of, gang issues up there too. But everybody has their, and never the twain shall meet. You cross in Chinatown, but you cross over to go to restaurants, and that's about it. But it's very, very segregated.
And Joe, just to what you said about, your reference to saying my black friend, because I grew up not really thinking about race, I didn't want my children to grow up using like what you just said. So I would always go the lady over there in the blue hat, or the, whatever other descriptive I could use. And my son came home from first grade, and I had never, again, I don't use that phrase, but my son came home from first grade and was so excited about his first new brown friend. I was like, where did that come from? And it stayed and Charlie stayed his best friend until he passed. And but I don't know I don't know if he picked that up from somebody else, but we never used that in our house. So guys, I got to go join my husband. He's down cooking. So
all right. Good for him. Well done him.
Bye.
Bye.
We're
Thank
going to
you all.
wrap it up now anyway. Thank you guys. This was a great discussion. Thanks, Kat.
Regina said something about write what you know. And that's, if you're comfortable writing about something and you know about what you're writing, and you're not just like, it's not like Sherry was talking about earlier, sort of being a mercenary and straining for it.
Yeah. It
comes across okay. I was very, very excited when our school integrated. I just was so excited about it. And I didn't understand why people weren't. It was like, oh my God, here's a whole new set of friends I'm gonna have. I just didn't understand why people had bad feelings about it.
Well, and I don't think it's so much as write. It's no longer write what you know. I mean, that's always a good starting point, I think, for newer writers, but it definitely has to be write what you're willing to know.
Yeah.
If you don't know it, do the research.
Yeah, I would say sometimes write what you know can be a really short journey. I mean, but you write, you learn.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I think it would be. So it's important to know what you write about before you write it. Maybe you don't know it when you start, but
it's an exploration. Yeah.
Yes.
Carol, you have a question or something?
Carol?
That was the point that I wanted to make, is to say to know what you write. Also, I mean, as Southerners, we have been steeped in a vat of sexism, racism, a particular brand of culture, a the distillation is a little more potent in some than others. I mean, we have variations, there are shades of that, but we all have it. And it is the perspective from which we write. I think that you, in order to be genuine, have to write from what you know and have it come from that perspective, whether or not the subject material is specifically that or not. It's impossible, in my opinion, to create characters and not imbue them with certain characteristics and weight those characteristics according to some sort of idea of people and personalities. And so I think that, to get to Scott's question, I think that on some level, a person must write from who they are and what they know.
There's
Yeah,
a writer
because
from
it is
North
different.
Carolina named Pam Durban. And this idea is not original to Pam, but it's who I hear it from all the time. And it's that that writers, that artists, that creative types of any kind have required subject matter. There are these worlds that you want to understand. There are the ideas and identities and places and concepts that you return to time and time again because you have some sense of connection to them. And it's hard to be in the South, which is such a complicated, conflicted place, and not have that be one of your required subject areas if you are a creative soul in the South. But I don't think you have to be from the South to be interested in it, to want to write about it. Alice Ravenel Hughes Smith, the artist, has been mentioned earlier. There was another Charleston Renaissance artist, Alfred Huddy, not from the South, came to Charleston and very famously sent a telegraph back to his wife, "I've found heaven, come immediately," right, which was a slogan in Charleston for a long time. But was fascinated by the world he saw and wanted to know more about it, wanted to immerse himself in it and try and explain it to himself and others. We can name any number of writers who've had that same kind of experience. It's also entirely possible to live in the South and not care a single thing about Southernness and not want to write about it or delve into it too deeply at all, but have other creative interests. Those things are not as clear cut as you might think, but thank God people are doing important work in all of those directions.
Very good. Hey, everybody, this was a brilliant, fun talk. Does anyone have
It was
any?
tons of fun.
I'm sorry, Joe.
I said, no, this has been tons of fun.
Yeah, tons of fun. Outstanding.
I
Thank
didn't even
you all
realize
for
time
being
had gotten
here.
away from us like it has.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody, for being here and for weighing in. If you have any questions, I put Joe's and Jonathan's info for the Literary Center up there too. And if y'all need anything, you can always email any of us or email mainstreetreads@gmail.com, and I'll make sure and get y'all info or get you connected to Jonathan or Joe. And thank you, guys. Thanks for being here tonight. That was a very fun discussion. Appreciate it.
Thank all of y'all.
Thanks, everybody.
Oh, yeah.
All y'all. Yeah.
All
That's
y'all.
plural. That's plural here. All y'all. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Right.